Hey listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. Can I get personal with you for a moment? When I was preparing for this interview with Myra, I was reading her memoir, 57 Fridays, and sneezing and coughing my way through another round of the grief flu, one that hit me twice in a month after my dog Captain died in December. 57 Fridays chronicles Myra and her family's heartbreaking experience of grieving for their daughter, Havi, who was just 15 months when she was diagnosed with Tay-Sachs, a fatal neurodegenerative disease. Havi died when she was 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days old. Myra's writing is stunning. She pulls you right into the moment, into the love, the pain, and the unimaginable reality of watching Havi slowly lose all physical and mental functioning. Her words hit me hard. As I read about how Myra learned to read Havi's signals, to notice every small shift, every loss, I was transported back to our last weeks, days, and hours with Captain. And here's the thing. Even though I fully believe that grief is grief and all of it is valid, I'm still shaped by a world that often dismisses the grief of losing a pet. I spent years in grief groups hearing about how painful it can be when someone compares the loss of a child, a sibling, or a parent to the death of a dog or hamster. And yet, with Myra, I felt a sense of connection and understanding that went way beyond those embedded beliefs and fears. I have a sense you're going to feel that connection too, because Myra's love for Havi and for the way Havi changed her life and the lives of everyone who knew her or will come to know her through 57 Fridays is limitless. In addition to being a writer, Myra is a certified compassionate bereavement care provider and the founder of eMotion, a nonprofit organization created to support community, movement, and ritual to enhance coping and resilience. I'm grateful to Myra for having this conversation with me, and I'm grateful to you for tuning in. Myra, welcome. I'm looking forward to our time together.
Thank you, Jenna. Me too. It's an honor.
How is your grief showing up today?
Today, in the middle of Boston winter, I think on Valentine's Day, today's Valentine's Day, and I have 2 living children who are under 5. And so my grief over my daughter who died, my daughter Havi who died, shows up at this particular time as really a missing, as an ache, as a yearning, albeit 4 years later, as a wishing that she could be in the playroom opening Valentine's Day cards with her siblings. And so I think there's really this yearning for physical touch today and lately that is always there but feels a bit sharper today.
I'm curious, Myra, on days like today, Valentine's Day, or other more like milestone-y holiday things, do you find yourself calculating Havi would be this age right now? Havi would be doing this right now?
Milestones certainly create, I think, an exaggeration of the reality that she is not here, that she is not advancing, that her life and death are and were so unnatural. And yet that calculation for me, I find happens all the time and more often actually in the moments that aren't hallmarked, the moments that are quiet, that are intimate, that are daily. And I think that some of that is because as a parent, we want our children, our child to show up in everyday ways, in mundane ways, not always in extraordinary or exceptional moments. And so for me, it's really in the everyday that it feels like I'm doing the calculations of, we should be getting ready to think about first grade for Havi now. And, she'd be outgrowing this sweater. And, why is Kaya wearing this hand-me-down? So certainly the holidays aren't easy because as we know, community is so ill-equipped to show up for grieving people. And so sometimes that gets highlighted on these holidays. Yeah.
You've shared your story and Javi's story in many different arenas, including your book, 57 Fridays. And I'm curious, in this moment, what feels the most important to share about Javi?
Just a few days ago, someone who read the book sent me a note and said, "I never knew that loss could be so loving. And now I do. And it's changed my life." And I sat with that note for a little while. And what struck me about it is that Havi gave us, and where I am now in my grief today, is that it's really that love that I want to share, bring, convey, hold, give in all aspects of my life, and that's the way that she exists in me and in our family and in others. And in a world that's filled with so much hate and destruction and division, I think her life and death is a reminder that love exists, and it can exist in big and small ways, in ways we never expected, when we demand it, when we need it, when we nurture it. And now I like to think about and talk about her and offer other people who are experiencing some elements of what I did this sort of concept that we can hold our people around us, we can hold community to higher standards of love for grieving people. And here's how we can think about it and talk about it and move with it. And it shouldn't be the burden of the griever to do that. And fortunately, Dougie Center exists in such a profound way and is leading the way in terms of education on this. But oftentimes, that's what's required of us grievers, is to demand and insist that our people who we can't see and touch matter. And so the essence of love, I think, is now where Havi lives. In terms of what I like people to know about her, it's that she was just 2.5 and she got so little time. And that excruciating reality of what it's like to be a parent who loses a child and who loses a young child has such ripple effects that are constantly changing and evolving and surprising me. And maybe that speaks to just how profound her life is and was.
Would you be able to paint a picture of what Havi looked like?
She had these big hazel green eyes. Actually, Matt, my husband, and I could never land on what exactly the color of her eyes were. We got in a little argument when we were filling out a passport application for her about what we should put as her eye color, thinking we were going to take her out of the country. But her eye color seemed to sort of change and glisten and sparkle, and it just captivated people, these big hazel green eyes. She had beautiful blonde, kind of curly hair. I'm sure that blonde hair would have gotten darker over time. I'm a brunette, and so is Matt. And she had this laugh, this giggle that we'd call the Hav giggle, that just stopped people in their tracks and felt like it came from this deepest place that really couldn't be stopped once it got going.
Mm. One of the things that stood out to me in reading your book, 57 Fridays, was once you received the diagnosis of Tay-Sachs for Havi and sort of put together the puzzle of some of what you had been seeing in her physically. And that I was like, oh, Javi never got to the place where she was using words to communicate. So you had her giggle, you had her laugh, but the way you and Matt were able to connect with her and have like conversations with her, I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how that came to be for you.
It first came as a belief, this belief that was required of us really as her parents, this belief that we could connect with her, that we could communicate with her without words, and that we really can't underestimate the power of connection that comes from other ways of hearing and seeing and feeling. And once I believed that, like really trusted myself, trusted that I could intuit what she was trying to tell me, that I could hear what she was sharing without her being able to speak. That belief really did wonders for how close I felt to her and how comfortable, although it was the most uncomfortable situation I could possibly be in as a mother, sort of watching her die and never being able to hear her speak a word, I got comfortable with the idea that our relationship was powerful and real, and I trusted it. And so I think it came from that place of self-trust that I could tell when she moved a certain way, or if she lifted her chin in a particular direction, that she was telling me something, and I could respond and see in the way she relaxed her shoulders, or the way that maybe one of her legs sort of went from being incredibly tight to loosening just a little bit, that was really the same as saying like, Mom, I'm good, as being able to hear those words. And so when we moved from sort of trust to trying to figure out how we were going to be with her, we started realizing that writing to her in this journal. I ended up buying a journal from a local Boston bookshop, and then every time I'd fill up the journal, I'd go back and get the exact same one. And so now our house is filled with a lot of them. Every entry would start with Dear Beauty, and that's what I called her, and Matt called her Peanut. And when he would write, it would be Dear Peanut. And when we would write to her in those pages, it really felt like she was on the receiving end of them. We believed that this wasn't some woo-woo sort of sentiment, that this was how we parented her, and that so long as she was sort of giving us back these indications that she was okay, that gave us some momentum in terms of how our relationship evolved in our day-to-day communication.
I'm curious how your connection to Javi's life story and her death story has changed over the years, because you and Matt just went past the 4-year anniversary mark of Javi's death, and how has that shifted over time, and how do you feel about how it shifted?
I hate it. I hate the passing of time is hard. It's hard. The distance between the last time I could touch her and hold her and sleep next to her and today, the farther that gets, the more work, the more effort it takes to remember. And we know that remember comes, re is again. And so when we remember someone, we bring them back into membership again and again. And that's so powerful and so healing. And so that distance just requires more effort. I think her life story at first, when we were living the trauma of watching her lose everything every day, and sort of being with and sitting with and living with the reality that her life and our life were forever changed, that was so intimate and personal, and it was really focused on our family, our little family. And when she died, we felt this sort of desire, this need to share her beyond the walls of our home. And that was because she taught us so much. And people would say, I remember when she was living with dying, people would say, she's a tremendous teacher. And I would scoff. I'd say, please don't call my 2-year-old who's dying a teacher. Like, come on, I just wish she were a 2-year-old. But in hindsight, I really do appreciate her teaching power and her wisdom. And it felt like what we needed was to sort of do with our grief. We had gone from being with it to doing with it. And the way we were doing with it was sharing her and writing about her and trying to become as deeply proficient in psychoeducation around grief and bereavement science as possible so that we could be of service. And so all of a sudden her life story went from hours to the shared hours, and her death story took a similar trajectory. When she first died, it was an experience that brought me to my knees in a way that I never fully appreciated. I could be in such immense pain and stand up again. And now her death story is a story that I think and I hope can be of service to others in terms of ways that we can actually support death and dying so that we can minimize regrets as much as possible for families facing situations like ours. This sort of relationship between contraction and expansion, I think in some ways parallels the change in her, in how we're experiencing her life and death stories.
I've heard from many folks that getting to some type of definitive diagnosis when someone you care about, you can tell, or yourself is having a variety of different symptoms and things are just like not matching up, but maybe doctors aren't responding in a way that's helpful. And it can just be a really arduous process. And I'm wondering what it was like for you and Matt and Havi to kind of go through that process to get to the place of the definitive diagnosis.
That diagnostic odyssey that ends in some life-limiting illness is devastating for families. And the way ours unfolded was we experienced the first year of Javi's life as maybe all first-time parents do, or lots of them do, as sort of some combination of exhaustion, joy, confusion, self-doubt. And Havi wasn't meeting milestones in the ways her peers were, but we were trying to keep our type A tendencies at bay and sort of trust that she was going to progress on her own. At a year, we got a diagnosis of developmental delay, which just meant full court pressure to get her all the supports that she needed to start to talk and start to walk. And so we did that. We used the Massachusetts state resources and even supplemented them. And it was clear that even all of that support and focus wasn't helping. And in fact, to the part of our conversation where we talked about sort of listening to Havi without hearing her speak, we could tell that she wasn't on board with this plan, that it wasn't serving her. And so we sought out a second opinion and saw another pediatrician. This was a pediatric neurologist. Now we're at about 14 months. That pediatric neurologist gave us a cerebral palsy diagnosis, which was confusing because there had been nothing traumatic about the birth experience. So she said, I'd like you to get Havi an MRI. Perhaps there's something genetic going on here. And also, I'm going to refer you to a colleague who is another neurologist who might have some thoughts. And so this was now our third interaction with the medical system. Javi's 15 months old. And it was this day, December 17th, 2019, that now we call Diagnosis Day, which underscores, your point, your question about how big a moment like this is for families, how important that day becomes. And it was that day that we received the Tay-Sachs diagnosis. Tay-Sachs is a fatal neurodegenerative disease, and there's preconception genetic testing that people can do to ensure that this horrible disease does not get passed on to the fetus. And unfortunately, what we learned was that a physician ordering error had been made in Matt's testing, and so he was misreported as not a carrier when he was a carrier, which meant that we learned how Havi got affected by Tay-Sachs. That day, that moment, hearing that news, I think everything collapses. Time, space, possibility. And it's really, I think Kate Bowler calls it apocalyptic time. Apocalyptic from the Greek root to lay bare or expose. And it's in this exposed state that in some ways there's so much devastation and despair that actually it invites some creativity, some sort of, I'm going to do whatever I need, whatever we need to be okay. And you sort of shed any of this accommodating tendency that I know lives deeply in me. And there was, while at the same time, the most immense devastation, there was also this liberation that, okay, rules as we knew them, social norms as we knew them, they weren't going to work for us. That we had entered a completely different time and space and reality, and we needed a playbook that didn't exist or that we hadn't been aware of.
Is there an example of one of those sort of social norms that post-diagnosis you were like, no, we are done with that?
Playgrounds were really, really difficult for us, like taking Havi to the playground on a Saturday morning where nearly every other young family in suburban Massachusetts was, to spend time before snack time and then nap time. Like that was just not a place that was safe or comfortable for us. Havi couldn't do the things that her peers were doing, or even the things that babies who were much younger than she were doing. And so we were aliens there, and we avoided it like the plague. And similarly, any sort of play date was off the table. Any conversation with parents about nap times or bedtime routines, things that just take up so much time and space, as they should in casual conversation among parents, felt like we just couldn't engage. Like we couldn't be in a conversation about how difficult nap time was when our daughter was dying. In that way, we needed to create a world that could exist almost parallel to the one that we had been planted in.
You know, Myra, I don't think I've thought about it that clearly, the isolation piece that can happen, right? I was thinking about it after someone has died. There can be this isolation of like, oh, we're no longer invited to kids' birthday parties, or we're no longer invited to this. But I hadn't really thought that clearly of when you receive a diagnosis like Tay-Sachs, how much that starts even in the disease process or the caregiving process of how painful it can be to see people doing the things that are so different. And also, like, how do you talk about it with people who aren't in that world?
That's right. Yeah, it was profoundly unsettling and totally confusing. And ultimately, I think that's why in that period from sort of diagnosis through her death, it required this creativity, really, that I think we were so lucky to be able to have, to find, to discover, and that so many people don't, is heartbreaking on top of what is already a totally shattering situation.
Which I feel like kind of brings us to the heart of your book, 57 Fridays, and the 57 Shabbirthdays that you held for Havi. Can you talk a little bit about that and how those rituals really shaped your time together?
After that moment that we got her diagnosis, and I described it as being apocalyptic, Matt and I were out on a walk, and I couldn't wrap my head or heart around the fact that Havi would only have 2 birthdays on this earth. I think that was the thing that I was almost obsessing over as a new mom. It just felt so unnatural and so unfair. So we started talking about this idea of how we would honor her life, how we could stretch out that time. Ended up landing on this idea of, well, on Fridays we celebrate Shabbat, and so what would it be like if we made Shabbat more of a birthday for her? And we combined those 2 ideas and called it Shabbirthday, Matt sort of jumped in and said. And we knew that these weren't going to be celebrations that were parties in any of the ways that we had always sort of known or imagined parties to be, purely joyful and festive and lighthearted. But we knew we needed time and space to hold what was too big to hold in everyday life as we had been going through it. We shared this idea actually with a rabbi a few days after coming up with it. And this rabbi said to us, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think you should move forward with these Shabbirthdays. I think it's going to be too painful to exist on Shabbat after Havi dies if you've transformed them in this way. Now I appreciate that that was a totally fear-based response that is so common. This fear of getting so close to pain and reality and wanting to hold it and touch it and be with it and even dance with it was like so scary for this particular rabbi that she advised against it. And fortunately, we had the conviction to say we were going to do it anyway. So those rituals became the place where we could, at the same time, hold our dying daughter who couldn't actually sit with her head up at the table, and be surrounded by friends and family and music and foods that became Havi's foods, like blueberries and cheesy eggs, and sort of turn what had been our Shabbats into these moments that were sacred. And sort of moving from kind of scary to sacred was ultimately life-sustaining. And we got 57 of them. They helped us because I couldn't exist beyond really a week in this time of my life. I couldn't look beyond the next Shabbirthday. And so having Shabbirthdays was a way to anchor me here in this world and stay with the pain and the love, and know that there was going to be a Shabbirthday that was, no more than 6 more nights away, to honor the immensity of what was happening. And now those are the 57 nights that I revisit, that I try to go back to sort of pull out and connect back with as much of the physicality of holding her, of repositioning her, of dancing with her, and of feeling like we had people in our lives who honored her, who felt like she mattered. And ultimately, as a parent, I think that's all you want, is to feel like your child matters in this world.
And to see your child being held by these people and by community that could love her and honor her in a way that you and Matt were also doing. But I really appreciated what you said of, like, it was too big to hold sometimes just in that intimacy. It needs a community or a space or a structure to help hold it.
Yeah, I think Suki Miller says ritual is the antidote to helplessness. And I understand that now. I understand why it gives us this container. And it's Dr. Bruce Perry's science, like the neurosequential model and the book he co-authored with Oprah, What Happened to You, where he talks a lot about this notion of dosed, moderate, and predictable exposures to stressors as being the way in which we can enhance resilience and build coping, versus the opposite of that, which is unpredictable, severe, prolonged, and that actually makes us more vulnerable. And there are so many of those exposures for grieving people that feel prolonged or severe, unpredictable. And this ritual really captures that notion of dosed, moderate, and predictable. We knew it was coming. We didn't sit for 2 hours and cry and talk. It wasn't a therapy session in that way. And so it was dosed in terms of sort of how we were experiencing the pain. And yet sort of being able to rely on it and trust it ended up being a lifeline.
What rituals have you found yourself turning to in the 4 years since Javi's death, since that last Shabbirthday?
Now, back to the blueberry. So Javi used to love blueberries. I actually ate a really bad blueberry the other day, which kind of bummed me out. But I guess Boston blueberries in the winter is a little risky. But anyway, she loved blueberries, and eventually she lost the ability to chew them. And so we started turning her love for blueberries into these blueberry smoothies, and we would sort of throw as many calorically dense items into that smoothie as possible, while always kind of retaining this like brilliant bluish purple color. And so for years after she died, I needed to hear that blender. I needed to see that blue, purplish, bright color, and I needed to taste that smoothie. That ritual of making that smoothie and having other people in our lives make Hav smoothies or order them is and was a ritual that I rely on, that is so, to go back to Dr. Perry's language, that's so dosed and moderate, but was really helpful for me. And now the ritual of always wearing purple became her color. I'm wearing it as we speak. And sort of anyone in her posse always has a splash of purple on them. And so that dressing in her in that way, it's so subtle, and yet it's a way for me to sort of move with her, bring her with me, and see her in others that has been really helpful and sustaining.
Something that also really so many things. I keep saying something stood out to me because almost everything stood out to me in your book. It's like, it feels like each page is a week's worth of intense emotional experiencing. So, which I think is paralleled, right, to how condensed Javi's life was and how much you got condensed into that time together with her. But one thing that really did stand out to me, and maybe because I just personally relate to it, was that sucker punch of like no new photos, no new memories, no new time together. And I'm curious, like, if you can go back to how that felt early on and how you relate to that now, 4 years later.
That was one of the scariest aspects of all of this, was that idea that there was permanence, like that there was permanently going to be a non-existence, a no more, in a world where like nothing is permanent, and that we are sort of coached to embrace impermanence. And this aspect of experiencing Javi's death and dying felt unbearable. And I think that it created at times when I wasn't regulated, this sense of like freneticism and like this frantic, almost feeling so frantic, like I needed to sort of hold on and capture and attach to as much of her as I possibly could. And how could I even do that? It was like an impossible sort of task. And so it certainly brought out the sort of inevitability of this loss that was going to be forever. And sitting with that at the time was terrifying. Now I am grateful for the ways in which we captured so many moments with her in journals, in photos, in videos, and yet it's so not enough. And what it now feels like is this new phase of learning of how do I create new memories? How do I believe that I can create new memories with her in places she never was, with people she never knew? The way to do that is to be so present with the pain of her non-existence that I can invite her into these spaces with me and sort of plant her there so that my world can continue to expand. Because otherwise, what can happen is that we shrink and we hide and we exist only in the places and the spaces where those memories lived and were held. And that's such a natural tendency. And so I'm always fighting that. I'm always sort of saying, no, this new place can become sacred. It can be Hav-filled, even though she didn't physically exist there.
Well, I think too about your book, 57 Fridays, and how everyone who reads it now has a relationship with Havi. And so all of these people who have read it, myself included, have a connection to her. And those are people who maybe never got to meet her in her physical form. But yeah, I think about that too.
Thank you. Yeah, that idea of knowing people who we never met in the sort of context of grieving people who have lost a child or a sibling or a parent, and introducing new people who never knew, who weren't there for their biography, but who now can come to know and love them, is so healing or I am hearing in the work that I'm in is so healing, because one of the fears is that no one else will know my child, no one else will love my child. And when we're intentional about creating spaces where it can be possible to share and know and learn and love, that's a really beautiful thing for us.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the work you're doing. I know you've mentioned a bit about like how much you wanted to learn about grief and how it shows up and how it's expressed. And you're working in that realm now. So I wonder if you wanted to share a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I knew that my life had changed when I was holding like the handbook of thanatology, and walking into cafes feeling like, okay, I've got my reading for the day. I'm like, oh yeah, I've been totally upended. So yeah, I hadn't been in grief work. I hadn't been in bereavement science. I was in nonprofit work focused on community-based organizations that really leverage the power of sport to increase opportunities for young people who deserved them. And I always sort of worked at the intersection of community, sport, and access. When Havi was diagnosed and then died, what I realized was that there was such a gap in those spaces, although they are so well-intentioned in terms of how we talk about grief, and this lack of grief-informed, to use the Dougie Center's term and work, is really problematic and damaging for young people, for families, for communities. And now I understood why. Mm-hmm. And so I went on this journey to try to figure out where I fit, where based on sort of my passions, my skills, and now my calling kind of collided. And the organization I ended up starting is one called Emotion. And Emotion is all about using movement, community, and ritual, the three elements that were so important for me and are so important for me, using those three elements to create programming for grieving people who need it. So it started as a pilot in Boston at a running store called Heartbreak Hill Running Company, which was just so perfectly named that it was like impossible for them not to be the founding partner. And I designed this 10-week grief-informed, movement-based experience for the first 18 people were bereaved siblings, parents, and partners. We ultimately, all 18 of us, all different ages, all different physical capabilities, trained for a half marathon together and followed this gently guided grief curricula along the way. And so there were in-person weekly meetups supplemented by these sort of these prompts and reflections and sort of way of thinking about how we're moving with grief and loss. I wasn't sure what was going to happen at the end of that 10 weeks. And what happened was the group said, we just want to keep, like, how can we keep going? And how do we share this with others? And this realization that movement is so inherently regulating. And from Dr. Bruce Perry, again, sort of this patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity that is the strongest somatosensory memory we have. It was from the time we were in our mother's womb listening to her heartbeat. That same patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity can be tapped into when we walk, run, dance, sew, swim. And that's why it's so helpful in terms of sort of creating more space for holding what is so painful, and learning to visit what is painful so that we build capacity. And so what was one group has now become many groups. And so Emotion now trains facilitators in this approach. We share the curricula, and it's really a near peer kind of communalistic way of trying to get people access to community, because grief's so isolating, to movement, and to some predictability around ritual. So that's kind of what I'm up to now.
And a little bit of our last bit together, how do you and your husband, Matt, help your younger children stay connected to Havi?
So Kaya is our second daughter. She's now 4.5, and she and Havi lived together for 6 months. But so Kaya doesn't have any memories. Of course, she has cellular memories, but of their time together. And then our son Ezra is 2.5, and he and Havi never lived together. But Ezra's now in Javi's room. Javi's photos are everywhere in our house. She is such a loud force that is really just a part of Kaya and Ezra's world, that it's impossible for them to not talk about their older sister. And they are both at ages where we are in a little bit of this sweet spot, because Kaya doesn't yet appreciate developmentally that death is permanent. And so we invite and love when, the other night she said to me, I'm going to tuck Havi into my heart extra tight tonight. And I started getting a little teary-eyed. And then she said, actually, I'm going to put Havi in my tissue box with all my other stuffed animals and special friends, or something like that. And it was like in that moment where, it was just sort of another example of how beautiful it is right now in the way Kaya gets to exist with her sister, that she gets to love her and talk about her and know that she's her sister, and yet not really yet appreciate what it means that she has died and will never see and touch and be with her in the way that she, the way that we wished that she could have. We keep Hav in our home sort of through these physical photos, through storytelling, through Shabbirthdays. Tonight is Valentine's Day Shabbirthday, so we still celebrate Shabbirthday every Friday. And Kai and Ezra know that it's kind of Havi's time. They wear purple almost every day. We're like the purple people. And so it's very normal. Like it's for such a tragic and unnatural experience for them right now, she's integrated very normally.
Well, and it just struck me, we spoke earlier about, through your book and other ways that you've shared about Havi, that all these other people get to have a relationship with her. And I was thinking about how times when a family has had a child die and they have another child who either was very, very young when that sibling died, or like Ezra had not yet been born, that somehow the parents are fully responsible for creating that relationship with the sibling who has died. And yet, your kids are showing they have their own relationships with Havi, connected to you, but separate from you too.
Totally. Like Kaya the other day said, I really wish that Havi could do this project with me. And like Ezra's not, like she said, like Ezra's not keeping up or something. And I think our tendency my tendency, I should say, my instinct would be to like get right in there and, kind of like talk about how sad it is that Havi can't do this project. But when I just sort of let Kaya be and let her talk and share and express and sort of go with the relationship in the way that she needs at the moment and actually not jump in, I get to see the way she's experiencing her sister and not reflect my own adult grief and perspective and pain onto her, which is not the same experience that she's having.
Well, Myra, I will, of course, link in the show notes to your book, 57 Fridays, all the places to find you and emotion. I'm just curious, as someone who has been, a listener of Grief Out Loud and is very much in this grief world in your own way of supporting others, is there any, and I hate this question, is there any last thing you were like, I really want to say on this interview that you want to make sure we hear today?
Maybe just like that the Dougie Center is incredible and that it really encourage. I've never experienced resources around grief and bereavement and talked to parents and siblings who have experienced grief, for whom everything we read and experience through the Dougie Center either resonates or is useful and is certainly not harmful, that is so powerful. And I would just encourage people to share resources that feel that way to you, because we need so many more advocates in this space. We need so many more people who are brave enough to stand up for grieving people and to realize that grief education is just as important as any other form of education. And so I think maybe that's what I would say.
And listeners, I did not prompt or pay Myra
to
say any of that.
I also have my own nonprofit that I never really talk about, so that's just kind of classic. Anyway.
Well, Myra, thank you for making space in your heart and your mind to have this conversation with me today, to share with our listeners about Havi, and for your really heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, beautiful book about Havi and her life and your time together. So really grateful for you.
Thank you, Jana. So nice to be in conversation with you, and it's really an honor.
And listeners out there, you know I say this each and every time, but thank you for making the show mean something. I'd love to hear from you. If you want to email me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org. That's also our main website where you'll find all of those resources that Myra just talked about, including tip sheets, activity sheets, workbooks, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Our podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund, and Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.